The hunger gnawed at Clara Bennett's stomach as she poured the last cup of grain into the trough, watching her 3 horses and 2 milk cows press forward eagerly. And she knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow there would be nothing left to give them. The Wyoming territory stretched harsh and unforgiving around her small ranch in the summer of 1882. And the drought had turned the grasslands to dust, killed her vegetable garden, and left her with impossible choices that kept her awake through the long nights. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 8 months now, thrown from a spooked horse and breaking his neck instantly, leaving her alone at 24 years old with a property she barely knew how to manage and debts that seemed to grow like tumbleweeds. She straightened up from the trough, pressing a hand to her lower back, feeling the exhaustion in every muscle. The animals were her responsibility now, her only companions besides the chickens that still scratched in the dirt yard, and she would starve herself before she let them suffer. She had been doing exactly that for the past 3 weeks, eating 1 small meal every other day, telling herself it was enough, ignoring the way her dresses hung loose on her frame and the dizziness that sometimes made her grip the fence posts for support. The sun was setting over the Medicine Bow Mountains in the distance, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Clara had any energy left to appreciate beauty. She walked slowly back toward the small wooden house, her boots kicking up dust with each step, and tried not to think about the fact that she had eaten nothing today except a handful of dried beans soaked in water. The well was still good, at least. She had water. That was something. Inside the house, she lit a single lamp to conserve oil and sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger Thomas had kept. The numbers swam before her tired eyes. She owed money at the general store in town, owed money to the bank for the property loan, owed money to the veterinarian who had tried to save their best breeding mare last spring. The mare had died anyway. Clara closed the ledger and rested her forehead on her crossed arms, not quite crying but close to it, feeling the weight of impossibility pressing down on her shoulders. She must have dozed off because when she jerked awake, full darkness had fallen outside the windows. The lamp had burned lower. Clara stood up stiffly and made her way to the bedroom, not bothering to change out of her work dress before collapsing onto the bed. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, the sleep of complete exhaustion. Morning arrived too soon with pale light filtering through the thin curtains. Clara forced herself up and went through her morning routine mechanically, washing her face in the basin, braiding her dark brown hair, pulling on her work boots. She did not go to the kitchen to look for breakfast because there was nothing there worth looking for. Instead, she headed straight outside to check on the animals, dreading the moment when she would have to stand before them with empty hands. But when she rounded the corner of the house, she stopped so abruptly that she nearly tripped over her own feet. There on her front porch, laid out on what looked like a clean canvas tarp, was an entire dressed steer. The meat had been professionally butchered, the cuts separated and organized, the hide folded neatly to one side. Clara stood frozen, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. This was easily 300 pounds of beef, maybe more. This was a fortune in meat. This was survival. She spun around, searching the empty landscape for any sign of who might have left this, but there was nothing except the endless rolling grassland and the distant mountains. No horse, no wagon, no person. Just the meat, appearing like a miracle on her doorstep. Her heart was pounding now, a mixture of confusion and desperate hope and caution. People did not simply give away entire steers. There had to be a reason, had to be an explanation, and Clara's first thought was debt collectors or men who might want something from her that she was not willing to give. But the meat was real and it was here, and her animals were hungry and she was hungry, and Clara made a decision. She would accept this gift, whatever strings might be attached, because the alternative was watching everything she had left slowly die. She spent the next 2 hours working harder than she had worked in weeks, cutting portions of the meat for herself, portions for the dogs she kept for protection. And yes, cooking down scraps and organ meat that she could mix with the remaining grain to stretch the animal feed further. The physical labor felt good after so many days of listless worry, and the smell of cooking beef made her stomach cramp with need. She ate her first real meal in weeks at midday, sitting on the porch step with a plate of steak and the last of her canned tomatoes, and she had to force herself to eat slowly because her shrunken stomach protested the sudden abundance. The protein made her feel dizzy in a different way, a good way, energy seeping back into her limbs. She was salting and preparing the meat for preservation, working in a determined rhythm when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Clara looked up to see a rider coming toward the house at an easy lope, and even from a distance she could tell this was someone who knew how to sit a horse. As he drew closer, she recognized him, though they had never actually spoken. His name was James Cordell, one of the ranch hands from the massive triple bar spread that lay 10 miles to the east. She had seen him in town a handful of times, had noticed him the way any woman would notice a man who stood over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and an air of quiet competence. He looked to be around 30, with sun-weathered skin and dark blonde hair that curled slightly under his hat brim. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch and touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Bennett. Clara stood, wiping her hands on her apron, trying to maintain some dignity despite being caught in the middle of butchering. Mr. Cordell. She did not know his first name, realized she had only heard other cowboys call him by his surname. I wanted to check that the meat was satisfactory, he said, his voice low and steady, with a slight Texas drawl that spoke of origins far south of Wyoming, so it had been him. Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion she had not expected. You left this? Yes, ma'am. He shifted slightly in the saddle, and she caught a flash of something that might have been uncertainty in his expression, as though he was not sure of his welcome. I hope I did not overstep. I heard in town that you were having a hard time of it, and we had a steer go lame at Triple Bar. Had to put it down anyway, and it seemed a waste to let the meat go when someone could use it. It was a lie, or at least a partial lie. Clara could tell by the way he did not quite meet her eyes. A lame steer would have been used by the ranch crew themselves, not given away. This had been a deliberate act of charity, and part of her bristled at being an object of pity. But the larger part of her, the practical part that had kept her alive these past months, was simply grateful. It was very kind of you, she managed to say. More than kind. I do not know how to thank you properly. James Cordell did meet her eyes then, and Clara was startled by the directness of his gaze, the clear blue of his eyes under the shadow of his hat. No thanks needed, Mrs. Bennett, just glad it could help. He began to turn his horse away, clearly intending to leave as abruptly as he had arrived, and Clara found herself speaking without planning to. Would you like some coffee? I just made a pot. Another lie. She had not made coffee in a week, unable to afford to waste the precious beans on herself alone. But she could make some now, could offer this man at least that much hospitality in return for his gift. He hesitated, and she saw the war on his face between politeness and wanting to stay. I would not want to impose. It is not an imposition, please, Clara gestured toward the porch. Let me at least offer you a cup of coffee after what you have done. James dismounted in one smooth motion and tied his horse to the porch rail. Up close, he was even taller than she had thought, and Clara had to tilt her head back to look at his face as he climbed the porch steps. He removed his hat, revealing hair flattened slightly by sweat, and held the hat awkwardly in his hands. That is very kind of you, ma'am. Clara went inside to make the coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she measured out the grounds. She could see him through the window, standing on her porch, looking out at her property with the assessing eye of someone who knew ranching. When the coffee was ready, she brought out 2 cups and they sat on the porch steps together, a careful foot of space between them. How long have you worked at Triple Bar? Clara asked, searching for safe conversation. 5 years now, James said, cradling the tin cup in his large hands. Came up from Texas looking for work and the foreman hired me on the spot. It is good work, good outfit. You are from Texas originally? Yes, ma'am. Small town outside San Antonio, nothing there for me anymore, so I drifted north. He took a sip of coffee. What about you? Were you born in Wyoming? Clara shook her head. Pennsylvania. My husband and I came out here 3 years ago. He had dreams of building something of his own away from the crowded East. She paused, the familiar grief tightening her chest. He died last fall. I heard. I am very sorry. James's voice carried genuine sympathy. That is a hard thing to face alone. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their coffee, and Clara found the quiet companionable rather than awkward. There was something steady about James Cordell, something that made her feel less alone even though they were virtual strangers. The drought has been hard on everyone, James said eventually. Triple Bar has been shipping cattle to Montana where there is still grass. Most of the smaller outfits are struggling. I do not have enough cattle left to ship anywhere, Clara admitted. I sold most of the herd to pay debts after Thomas died. I just have the horses and milk cows now and the chickens. I was trying to hold on until the rains came, but... She trailed off, not wanting to sound pitiful. James turned to look at her fully. You were feeding your animals and not yourself. It was not a question. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. The animals depend on me. You cannot take care of them if you starve to death, James said bluntly. Begging your pardon for speaking plain, but that is just fact. I am aware of that, Clara said, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. But what would you have me do? Let the horses die. They were my husband's pride. James was quiet for a long moment. I would have you accept help when it is offered, he said finally. I would have you understand that needing help does not make you weak. It makes you human. Clara felt unexpected tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She had spent so many months being strong, being self-sufficient, refusing to show vulnerability to the townspeople who looked at her with pity or calculation. I do not want to be anyone's charity case. It is not charity. James set down his empty cup. It is neighbors helping neighbors. That is how people survive out here. But you are not my neighbor. You are from Triple Bar. 10 miles is nothing in Wyoming, James said, a hint of a smile touching his mouth. That makes us neighbors in my book. Clara found herself almost smiling back despite everything. That is generous of you. James stood, settling his hat back on his head. I should get back before the foreman notices I am gone, but Mrs. Bennett, if you need anything at all, you can send word to Triple Bar and I will come. I mean that. She stood as well, looking up at him. Why are you doing this? You do not even know me. For a moment, she thought he would not answer. Then he said quietly, because I know what it is like to be alone and struggling, and I know what it means when someone extends a hand. Consider this me paying forward a kindness that was shown to me once. He moved toward his horse, then paused and looked back. And because you are working yourself to death trying to hold on to your husband's dream, and I think that takes a particular kind of courage that deserves respect. He mounted up before she could respond, touched his hat brim one more time in farewell, and rode away at that same easy lope. Clara stood on her porch and watched until he disappeared into the heat shimmer of distance, her coffee cup still warm in her hands, feeling something shift inside her chest that she could not quite name. The meat lasted 2 weeks, carefully preserved and rationed. Clara felt her strength returning, felt the fog of starvation lift from her mind. She worked on repairs around the property that she had been too weak to tackle before, fixed a section of fence, patched a leak in the barn roof. The animals looked better too, their coats gaining back some shine now that they had adequate feed mixed with the scraps and nutrition from the beef. She did not see James Cordell again during those 2 weeks, but she thought about him more than she wanted to admit. She thought about the directness of his blue eyes, the steadiness in his voice, the way he had not made her feel small or pitiful despite her obvious need. She thought about what he had said about courage, and it warmed something inside her that had been cold for a very long time. Then one afternoon, she was in the barn mucking out stalls when she heard horses outside. Multiple horses. Clara set down her pitchfork and walked out into the bright sunlight, shading her eyes, and saw 3 riders approaching. Her stomach clenched with instinctive wariness. Groups of men meant trouble more often than not for a woman alone. But as they drew closer, she recognized James Cordell in the lead, and her fear eased slightly. The other 2 men were cowboys she did not know, both young, probably in their early 20s. They were leading a 4th horse, a sturdy bay gelding loaded with supplies. James dismounted as they reached the yard. "Mrs. Bennett, I hope we are not intruding." "Not at all," Clara said, though her confusion was obvious. "What is all this?" "The boys and I had a talk with the Triple Bar foreman," James said, and there was something in his tone that suggested the talk had been more complicated than he was letting on. "Triple Bar has more horses than we need right now, and we thought you could use a good working gelding. This is Copper. He is 8 years old, sound, good temperament, trained for cattle work and pulling a wagon." Clara stared at the horse, then at James. "I cannot accept a horse, that is too much." "It is not a gift," James said quickly. "It is a loan. You use him for work, and when you are back on your feet, you can return him to Triple Bar. Or if you prefer, you can work off his value. The ranch always needs seamstress work, mending and such. The foreman's wife is overwhelmed with it." It was another lie, or at least a half-truth arranged to save her pride, and Clara knew it. But the offer was structured in a way that made it possible to accept without feeling like charity. She looked at the horse, a beautiful animal with intelligent eyes, and then at the supplies tied to his saddle. "What is in the packs?" One of the young cowboys, a red-headed kid with sunburned cheeks, spoke up eagerly. "Grain for your animals, ma'am, and some basic staples. Flour, beans, salt, coffee." The cook at Triple Bar said he overordered and needed to clear out the storage. More lies, more kindness disguised as convenience. Clara felt her throat tighten again with emotion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, looking directly at James. "All of you. Why do you care what happens to me?" The other 2 cowboys looked at James, clearly deferring to him, and James met Clara's gaze with that same steady directness. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I asked them to help me, and they are good men who agreed." The red-headed cowboy grinned. "Also because James would not shut up about it until we said yes." "Quiet, Murphy," James said, but there was no heat in it. He turned back to Clara. "Will you accept the help, Mrs. Bennett, please?" Clara looked at these 3 men, strangers really, who had ridden 10 miles out of their way to bring her aid. She thought about her pride, about her determination to manage alone, about all the reasons she should refuse. And then she thought about what James had said on his first visit, about accepting help making her human rather than weak. "Yes," she said quietly. "Yes, I will accept, and thank you, all of you. This means more than you can possibly know." They unloaded the supplies and got Copper settled in the barn while Clara made coffee and brought out the last of some biscuits she had made that morning with her dwindling flour. The young cowboys, Murphy and a quiet, dark-haired man named Santos, devoured the biscuits with flattering enthusiasm and regaled her with stories from Triple Bar, the daily mishaps and small comedies of ranch life. Clara found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. James sat slightly apart, letting the younger men entertain her, but Clara was aware of his presence in a way she could not quite explain. She noticed how he watched the property with an assessing eye, noticed when he quietly stood up and went to examine the fence she had repaired, testing the posts for sturdiness. When he came back to the porch, he nodded approval. "That is good work." "I am learning," Clara said, slowly. "You are doing more than learning, you are surviving." James accepted a refill of coffee from her. "That is something to be proud of." When the 3 men finally prepared to leave, Murphy and Santos mounted up quickly, but James lingered, and Clara got the sense he was waiting to speak to her alone. She walked with him to his horse, and he stood with the reins in his hand, clearly working up to something. "Mrs. "Bennett, I was wondering if you would permit me to call on you again," he said finally, the words coming out slightly rushed. "Not on ranch business, on personal business." Clara's heart did an odd little skip in her chest. She knew what he was asking, knew what he was suggesting, and she knew she should probably say no. Thomas had been gone less than a year. It was too soon. People would talk. But when she looked at James Cordell, at his honest face and hopeful eyes, she found she did not care about any of that. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." The smile that spread across James's face was like sunrise, transforming his weathered features. "Sunday afternoon, I have that time off. Sunday afternoon would be perfect." He mounted up then, still smiling, and the three men rode off with waves and farewells. Clara stood watching them go, her hand raised in goodbye, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Sunday arrived bright and hot, as every day seemed to be that summer. Clara spent the morning in a state of nervous energy, cleaning the house even though it was already clean, changing her dress 3 times before settling on her blue cotton one with the small white flowers, brushing her hair until it shone and pinning it up in a softer style than her usual practical braid. She felt foolish for caring so much about her appearance, felt like a girl preparing for her first beau instead of a widow of 24. But the flutter of anticipation in her stomach was undeniable. James arrived exactly when the sun marked 2 o'clock, riding up on his big roan horse with a bundle tied to his saddle. He had cleaned up too, Clara noticed, his face freshly shaved and his dark blonde hair still damp from washing. He wore a clean shirt and vest instead of his work clothes, and when he dismounted and removed his hat, she could smell soap and something like cedar. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted her, and there was a warmth in his voice that made her pulse quicken. "You look very lovely. Thank you." "And please call me Clara. I think we are past formalities at this point." "Clara," he repeated, as though testing how her name felt in his mouth. "Then you must call me James." "James," she echoed, smiling. He retrieved his bundle from the saddle and held it out to her with an almost shy expression. "I brought some things. I thought we might have a picnic, if that would be agreeable to you. There is a nice spot by the creek on the edge of your property, if it has not dried up completely." Clara took the bundle, feeling the weight of it, touched by the thought he had put into this. The creek is low but still running. A picnic sounds wonderful. They walked together across the sun-bleached grass toward the line of cottonwood trees that marked where water still flowed. James carried a blanket under one arm, and Clara carried the food bundle, and they did not talk much, but the silence was comfortable. Clara found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way his long stride shortened to match her pace, the way he reached out once to steady her when she stumbled slightly over a hidden stone. The creek was indeed low, just a trickle compared to what it must be in wetter years, but the cottonwoods provided blessed shade and the sound of moving water was soothing. James spread the blanket on a patch of grass and they settled down together. Clara opened the bundle to find fried chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and even a jar of pickles. "Did you make all this?" she asked in amazement. James laughed. "No, I am a terrible cook. I bribed the camp cook at Triple Bar, cost me 2 days of mucking stalls, but it was worth it." They ate and talked, and Clara discovered that talking with James was remarkably easy. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his family's small farm that had failed during a drought not unlike this one, about coming west to start over. She told him about Pennsylvania, about her parents who had died when she was young, about meeting Thomas at a church social and believing his dreams of Western adventure. She found herself sharing things she had not spoken aloud to anyone, the loneliness of her marriage at times, how Thomas had loved the idea of ranching more than the reality of it, how his death had been both a grief and a strange relief from trying to maintain a pretense of happiness. "That must sound terrible," she said, immediately regretting her honesty. "Speaking ill of the dead." "It sounds honest," James said quietly. "Marriage is not always what people expect it to be. That does not make you a bad person for admitting it." Clara looked at him gratefully. Have you ever been married? No. I came close once back in Texas. Her name was Sarah, but her father did not approve of a poor farmer's son, and she did not love me enough to go against him. James plucked a blade of grass and twisted it between his fingers. I was hurt at the time, but looking back, I think it was for the best. We were not well suited. Do you still think about her, sometimes, but not with any pain anymore, just as a memory of being young and thinking I knew what I wanted? He looked at Clara directly. I am not young anymore, and I know better now what matters. There was something in the way he said it, the way he looked at her, that made Clara's breath catch. And what matters? Honesty, kindness, strength of character. Someone who knows how to work hard and does not give up when things get difficult. James paused. Someone exactly like you, Clara. Her name in his mouth sounded like a caress. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you were starving yourself to feed your animals. I know you are out here alone trying to hold together a ranch that most men would have abandoned. I know you have more courage in your little finger than most people have in their whole body. James shifted closer on the blanket, not touching her but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him. I would like to know more, though, if you will let me. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. I would like that too. They sat by the creek until the shadows grew long, talking about everything and nothing. And when James finally stood to walk her back to the house, he offered his hand to help her up. Clara took it, feeling the strength of his calloused palm against hers, and when she was standing, he did not immediately let go. They stood there for a moment, hands linked, looking at each other in the dappled shade of the cottonwoods. May I call on you again? James asked, his voice low. Yes, Clara whispered. Please. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. Then he released her and they walked back to the house, the space between them humming with possibility. James began calling on Clara every Sunday, and sometimes on weekday evenings when his work was done early. He would ride over in the long summer twilight, and they would sit on her porch talking, or he would help her with tasks around the property that were too difficult for one person alone. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never made her feel rushed or pressured. He was patient and steady and kind, and Clara found herself falling for him with an ease that should have frightened her but somehow did not. He brought her things sometimes, always with an excuse. Extra vegetables from the ranch garden that would go to waste otherwise. A book he thought she might enjoy. A new work glove to replace her worn one. Each gift was small enough not to offend her pride but thoughtful enough to show he was paying attention to her needs. And in return, Clara began mending clothing for him, patching his worn work shirts and reinforcing the knees of his trousers, finding satisfaction in caring for him in these small domestic ways. August arrived with no break in the heat or the drought. The grass was completely dead now, brown and brittle as straw. Triple Bar was shipping more cattle out, unable to sustain the herd size through the dry spell. Other smaller ranches were failing, families packing up and leaving in wagons loaded with whatever they could salvage. Clara's situation was precarious as ever, but with the supplies James and his friends had brought, and with James's regular presence providing both practical help and emotional support, she was managing. One evening in mid-August, James arrived later than usual, and Clara could see the tension in his shoulders before he even dismounted. She met him in the yard, worry creasing her forehead. What is wrong? Triple Bar is laying off hands, James said without preamble. Foreman told us today. They are keeping skeleton crew through the winter, letting the rest of us go. Clara's stomach dropped. Are you being let go? I am on the cut list, yes. I have until the end of the month to find something else or move on. James ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I have been asking around at other ranches, but everyone is in the same situation. Nobody is hiring right now. Clara's mind was racing. James losing his position meant James leaving the area, meant the end of these visits that had become the center of her life, meant losing him just when she had found him. The thought was unbearable. She reached out and took his hand without thinking, gripping it tightly. There has to be something. James looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, and something in his expression made Clara's breath catch. "There is one option I have been thinking about," he said slowly, "but I do not know how you would feel about it. Tell me." He took a breath. "I have some money saved. Not a lot, but enough to buy a small herd if I could find pasture for them. Your property here, you have grazing rights on the federal land that borders your acreage. That is over 1,000 acres. Even in drought, there is enough browse to sustain a small herd if we are careful." Clara was following his logic, seeing where he was headed. "You want to start your own herd here?" "I want to partner with you," James corrected. "You have the land rights, I have the cattle expertise and the money to start. We could work together, build this ranch into something sustainable. Split everything 50-50. He paused, his blue eyes searching her face. "But Clara, I need you to understand what I am really asking here. I am asking to tie my future to yours. I am asking to be in your life every day, not just Sunday visits. I am asking for a chance to prove I can be what you need." Clara's heart was in her throat. This was not a marriage proposal, not exactly, but it was something just as significant. A commitment, a promise, a joining of lives and futures. "James, what if it does not work? What if the drought continues and we lose everything? You would be giving up the security of finding another ranch job to gamble on something that might fail." "I would rather gamble on us than take any sure thing anywhere else," James said fiercely. "Clara, I am falling in love with you." "Actually, that is a lie. I have already fallen. I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and your kindness. I love the way you refuse to give up even when everything is stacked against you. I love talking to you and being near you and the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. I want to build a life with you, and if this ranch is part of that, then I want to pour everything I have into making it succeed." Clara was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. "I love you too," she said through her tears. "I did not think I could feel this way again. I did not think I wanted to, but I do. I love you, James." He pulled her into his arms then, and Clara went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and feeling his heart pound beneath her cheek. His arms were strong around her, solid and real, and she felt safer than she had felt in years. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other in the fading light. When they finally pulled apart, James cupped her face in his hands and looked at her seriously. "There is something else. If we do this, if we become partners in the ranch, people will talk. A single woman and a single man working together, living on the same property. It will cause gossip, might damage your reputation." Clara knew he was right. It was 1882 in Wyoming territory, and propriety mattered, especially for women. But she also knew what she wanted, knew with a certainty that felt like bedrock. "Then we should not be single," she said clearly. "We should get married." James went very still. "Clara, are you proposing to me?" "I suppose I am," Clara said, feeling a wild sort of courage. "Unless you are going to beat me to it." A grin split James's face. "Clara Bennett, would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Clara said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." James kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that grew deeper as Clara responded, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. It was her first kiss since Thomas had died, and it felt nothing like kissing Thomas had felt. This was fire and tenderness all at once. This was coming home and setting out on adventure at the same time. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "How soon?" he asked. "How soon will you marry me?" "As soon as possible," Clara said. "This week, if we can arrange it." They were married 3 days later in the small church in town, with Murphy and Santos standing up as witnesses and the minister's wife providing a bouquet of wildflowers she had dried from earlier in the summer. Clara wore her best dress, a green silk that had been her wedding dress when she married Thomas, and felt not a moment's guilt about it. That dress represented hope for a new life, and that was exactly what she was getting now, a second chance at happiness with a man she truly loved. James wore a borrowed suit jacket over his clean shirt and looked nervous and proud, and so handsome that Clara could hardly believe he was hers. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, James kissed her sweetly in front of the tiny congregation, and Clara heard genuine joy in the congratulations that followed. They rode back to the ranch together, James on his roan and Clara on Copper, and everything looked different somehow now that it was truly theirs together. James had already brought his few possessions over the day before, the accumulated belongings of a cowboy's life fitting into 2 saddlebags and a bedroll. That night, they made love in Clara's bed that was now their bed, and Clara discovered that physical intimacy could be joyful rather than merely dutiful. James was gentle and passionate and attentive, and afterward they lay tangled together in the darkness, talking about their plans for the future until they fell asleep mid-conversation, completely content. The next morning, they began their new life as partners in every sense. James used his saved money to purchase 20 head of young cattle from a rancher who was selling out, good stock that would form the foundation of their herd. They spent weeks working dawn to dusk, riding out to check on the cattle grazing on the federal land, repairing fences, preparing for the winter that would come eventually even if summer felt eternal. It was hard work, exhausting work, but they did it together and that made all the difference. Clara learned cattle work from James, learned how to spot illness in livestock, how to repair tack, how to read the weather signs that old-timers swore by. James learned from her too, the careful household management and planning that kept them fed through lean times, the way to make a little stretch a long way. They were a good team, their skills complementing each other, and the ranch began to stabilize under their combined efforts. The first rain came in late September, just a small shower but enough to bring tears of relief to both their eyes. More rain followed in October, the drought finally breaking, and the grass began to show hints of green again. Their cattle fattened on the recovering pasture. The horses gained back their condition. Clara's chickens laid more eggs with better feed available. Small victories, but they felt enormous. Winter came with cold and snow, and the work changed but did not lessen. James was out in all weather checking on the cattle, making sure they had access to water, bringing hay to supplement their forage. Clara managed the household, the endless cooking and cleaning and mending, and also kept the books, tracking their expenses and income with a precision that impressed James. They were not prosperous yet, but they were surviving, and after the desperation of the previous months, survival felt like triumph. They celebrated their first Christmas together with a modest dinner and gifts they had made for each other. Clara gave James a new shirt she had sewn from fabric she had carefully saved money to buy. James gave Clara a pair of leather gloves he had crafted himself, fitted exactly to her smaller hands. They sat together by the fire that evening, Clara tucked under James's arm, and counted their blessings aloud. Each other, the ranch, their health, the recovering land. It was enough. It was more than enough. Spring of 1883 arrived with wildflowers carpeting the grassland and the cattle growing fat. They bred their cows and waited anxiously for the calves that would represent their first real profit. Clara discovered she was pregnant in April, a realization that brought both joy and terror. She told James one evening after dinner, just blurting it out because she could not think of a graceful way to share the news. James's face went through a series of expressions so quickly Clara almost laughed. Shock, then wonder, then fierce protectiveness. He pulled her into his arms carefully as though she might break. "Are you happy?" he asked into her hair. "Yes," Clara said, and realized it was completely true. "Yes, I am happy. Are you?" "I am terrified," James admitted, "and happier than I have ever been in my life." The pregnancy progressed well through the summer. Clara continued working as long as she could, refusing to be treated like an invalid, but James fussed over her constantly. He insisted she ride Copper instead of walking long distances. He took over the heavier household tasks. He brought her wildflowers for no reason except that they were pretty, and he thought they would make her smile. Their cattle had healthy calves, better numbers than they had dared hope for. They sold some of the young steers in July and made enough money to pay off Clara's remaining debts and buy supplies for the coming year. The ranch was on solid footing now, no longer teetering on the edge of failure. They were actually succeeding. Clara went into labor on a cold night in October, attended by the doctor from town and a neighbor woman who had experience with births. James paced outside for hours, terrified and helpless, until finally the doctor emerged to tell him he had a son. James burst into the bedroom to find Clara exhausted but glowing, holding a red-faced infant who was howling his displeasure at being born. "A boy," Clara said softly, looking up at James with such love in her eyes that he felt his throat close with emotion. "We have a son, James." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at his child, this tiny perfect person who was somehow part of him and part of Clara and wholly himself all at once. "He is beautiful. You are beautiful." James touched one finger to the baby's tiny fist and felt those miniature fingers close around his with surprising strength. What should we name him? They had discussed names but never decided. Now Clara said, "Thomas, after my first husband, and James as a middle name after you. Thomas James Cordell, so he carries both our histories forward." James felt tears prick at his eyes. The generosity of that gesture, the acknowledgement that Clara's past was part of who she was and that was acceptable and right, moved him deeply. "Thomas James Cordell," he repeated. "It is perfect." Their son thrived, a healthy, loud baby who demanded constant attention and gave endless joy in return. Clara proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving even when exhausted from sleepless nights. James discovered reserves of tenderness he had not known he possessed, content to spend hours simply watching his wife and child, marveling at the life they had built. The ranch continued to grow. In spring of 1884, they bought more cattle with their profits and hired a part-time hand, a young Mexican man named Diego who was hardworking and loyal. In 1885, they added sheep as well, diversifying their livestock. The grass continued to recover, the rains coming more reliably now. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, the kind of solid middle-class comfort that meant security and the ability to plan for the future. Thomas grew from infant to toddler, a sturdy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. He adored the animals and showed early signs of his father's natural way with horses. Clara would watch James teaching their son to sit on the gentle old mare they kept for farm work, both of them patient and careful, and her heart would overflow with gratitude for this life she had somehow been given. In the summer of 1886, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news brought no terror, only quiet joy. They had done this before. They knew what to expect, and their ranch was stable enough now that Clara could afford to rest when needed without jeopardizing their survival. Their daughter was born in February of 1887 during a howling blizzard that trapped them in the house for 3 days. The same doctor attended, arriving just hours before Clara went into labor, and James was by her side this time, holding her hand through the contractions. The birth was easier than the first, and when Clara heard that first sharp cry, she wept with relief. "A daughter," the doctor announced, placing the cleaned infant in Clara's arms. "A healthy baby girl." James looked down at his daughter, tiny and red and perfect, and felt his heart expand. "She looks like you," he said to Clara. "She has your nose." Clara laughed weakly. "She is 10 minutes old. She looks like a wrinkled little bean." "A beautiful wrinkled bean," James insisted. "What shall we name her?" "Rose," Clara said without hesitation. "Rose Sarah Cordell." Sarah for James's lost love, acknowledgement that his past was part of him too. James kissed her forehead. "Rose Sarah Cordell, welcome to the family, little one." Rose proved to be a quieter baby than Thomas had been, content to watch the world with wide, curious eyes. Thomas, now 3 1/2, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything, bringing Clara diapers and fetching James when the baby cried. They were a family, complete and happy, and Clara sometimes had to pinch herself to believe it was real. The years rolled forward in the way time does when you are content, each season bringing its own work and its own rewards. The cattle herd grew. They built a new barn in 1888, a proper structure with space for all their livestock and equipment. They added 2 more rooms to the house in 1889, creating separate bedrooms for the children and a proper parlor for receiving the guests, who came more frequently now that they were established members of the ranching community. Thomas started school in town in 1890, riding in with James when he had business there. Rose grew into a bright, determined toddler who followed her father everywhere and demanded to help with even the tasks she was far too small to actually do. Clara's days were full of cooking and cleaning and childcare and bookkeeping, but she had never been happier. This was the life she had dreamed of without knowing she was dreaming it. James turned 40 in 1892, his dark blonde hair showing threads of gray now, his face lined by sun and work, but still handsome to Clara's eyes. She was 34, her figure no longer girlish after 2 children but strong and capable. They had been married 10 years, and Clara loved him more now than she had on their wedding day, the kind of deep, enduring love built on shared work and mutual respect and countless small kindnesses. One evening that summer, after the children were in bed, they sat together on the porch as they had done countless times before, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. The grassland spread green and healthy around them, dotted with their cattle, and the sound of horses moving in the corral was peaceful and familiar. "Do you remember the day we met?" James asked suddenly. "When I brought you that steer," Clara smiled. "I remember thinking you were either the kindest man I had ever encountered or you wanted something from me." "I did want something from you," James said. "I wanted you to survive, and then I got to know you and I wanted everything. Your smile, your conversation, your future." He took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in the gesture that had become habitual over the years. "I never imagined I could be this happy, Clara. Some days I am almost afraid of it, like it is too good and something will come along to take it away." "Nothing is going to take it away," Clara said firmly. "We built this together. It is real and it is solid and it is ours." James pulled her closer and she settled against his side, fitting perfectly as she always did. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. From inside the house came a small sound, one of the children stirring in sleep, and then quiet again. "I love you," James said softly. "Every single day I love you more." "And I love you," Clara replied. "You saved my life, you know. That day you brought the meat, I would not have survived another week without help." "We saved each other," James corrected. "You gave me a purpose, a reason to put down roots. You gave me a home and a family. You gave me everything that matters." Clara turned her head to kiss him, a soft brush of lips that held 10 years of devotion and partnership and love. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "We did all right, did we not? The widow and the cowboy." "We did better than all right," James said. "We did extraordinary." And as they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the land they had saved and the life they had built, Clara knew he was exactly right. They had taken desperation and loneliness and need and transformed it into something beautiful. They had survived and thrived and created a legacy that would outlast them both. Years continued to pass in their rhythms of hard work and simple joy. Thomas grew tall and capable, taking on more responsibility around the ranch as he reached his teenage years. Rose proved to have her mother's head for numbers, and started helping with the books when she was only 9, her neat handwriting filling the ledgers with careful precision. The ranch prospered through good years and weathered lean ones, but never again did they face the desperate circumstances of that drought summer before Clara and James found each other. In 1897, Thomas turned 14 and announced he wanted to try his hand at breaking horses. James worked with him patiently, teaching him the methods that relied on trust rather than force, and father and son spent long hours in the corral together. Clara would watch them from the house, seeing James's gestures mirrored in Thomas's movements, the legacy of skill passed down from one generation to the next. Rose, at 10 years old, declared she wanted to learn to rope cattle like her father and brother. James made her a child-sized lasso and taught her the basics, and she practiced endlessly in the yard, catching fence posts and patient dogs and eventually the slower cattle. She had determination and natural athleticism, and James told Clara proudly that their daughter would be running the ranch someday with the same fierce competence her mother showed. The new century arrived with celebrations in town, everyone gathering to mark the turn from 1899 to 1900. Clara and James attended with their children, now 15 and 12, and danced together to fiddle music in the town hall. Clara looked around at her neighbors, people who had become genuine friends over the years, and at her beautiful children, and at her husband who still made her heart skip after 18 years of marriage, and felt blessed beyond measure. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903 quietly, just the family and a few close friends. Murphy and Santos, those young cowboys who had helped James bring supplies all those years ago, both had ranches of their own now and families of their own, but they remained close friends. Murphy gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry, talking about the day James had insisted they help him court a widow by bringing her a horse and how smitten James had been even then. "I knew you were done for," Murphy said, grinning at James. "The way you talked about her, we all knew." "Best decision you ever made, asking her to marry you. Best decision she ever made, saying yes," James replied, raising his glass to Clara. "Everything good in my life started the day she agreed to take a chance on me." Thomas was 21 now, a man grown and courting a girl from a neighboring ranch. Rose was 18 and had admirers of her own, though she claimed she was too busy learning the ranch business to bother with romance yet. Clara saw herself in her daughter's independence and determination and loved her fiercely for it. When Thomas married in the spring of 1904, it was a big celebration, the wedding held at the ranch with half the county in attendance. The young couple planned to build a house on the north section of the property, expanding the ranch into a true family compound. James handed over more of the daily operations to Thomas, acknowledging that he was 52 now and slowing down, though Clara thought he was still the strongest man she knew. Rose announced in 1906 that she wanted to go to the new agricultural college that had opened in Laramie to study ranch management and animal husbandry formally. It was unusual for a woman, but Clara and James had never raised their daughter to believe her gender should limit her ambitions. They helped her pack and drove her to Laramie themselves, and Clara cried watching Rose walk into the college building with her head held high and her shoulders squared with determination. Thomas and his wife had their first child in 1907, a grandson that made James tear up when he held the infant for the first time. Clara became a grandmother at 49 and found she loved the role, loved being able to spoil a baby and then hand it back to its parents for the difficult parts. The ranch had a new generation now, the legacy continuing forward. Rose graduated from college in 1910 and returned to the ranch with innovative ideas about breeding programs and pasture rotation. She and Thomas worked together seamlessly, and Clara gradually stepped back from the day-to-day management, content to advise when asked and otherwise enjoy the fruits of what she and James had built. James turned 60 in 1912, his hair fully gray now, his face deeply lined, but his blue eyes still clear and direct as they had been the first day Clara met him. He moved slower than he once had, troubled sometimes by aching joints and old injuries from decades of ranch work. But his mind was sharp and his devotion to Clara unwavering. They celebrated their 30th anniversary that same year with their children, their grandson, and a second grandchild on the way. The ranch was thriving under Thomas and Rose's management, covering 3 times as much land as it had when Clara and James started, and supporting not just their family but several hired hands and their families as well. It was a true success, built from desperation and sacrifice and stubborn determination and love. One evening in late summer, Clara and James took a walk together out to the spot by the creek where they had shared their first picnic more than 30 years before. The cottonwood trees were older and fuller now, the creek running strong after good spring rains. They sat on the bank together, James's arm around Clara's shoulders, and looked back at the house visible in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where Rose was cooking dinner. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I had not brought you that steer?" James asked quietly. "If I had just minded my own business." "I try not to," Clara admitted. "I think I would have died, actually. Or been forced to abandon the ranch and go back east to find factory work or become a governess. Either way, I would have lost everything, and I would never have had this." She gestured at the landscape around them, at the house and the life they had built. "I would never have had you. I would have been just another cowboy drifting from job to job," James said, "never putting down roots, never having a real home, growing old alone and bitter." He tightened his arm around her. "You gave me purpose, Clara. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Clara corrected, echoing what James had said so many years ago. "We saved each other." They sat until the sunset painted the sky in those same glorious shades Clara remembered from decades of Wyoming evenings, until the stars began to emerge, and the air grew cool with the promise of autumn coming. Finally, James stood and helped Clara to her feet, his movements careful with age but his grip still strong. They walked back to the house hand in hand, 2 people who had weathered everything life could throw at them and emerged not just intact but triumphant. Inside, their family waited. Rose looked up from her cooking and smiled to see her parents arrive together. Thomas came in from the evening chores with his young son riding on his shoulders. The house was full of life and laughter and the comfort of people who loved each other deeply. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in, and felt James's hand squeeze hers. "We did good," he murmured into her ear. "We did extraordinary," Clara replied, borrowing his own words from years ago, and she meant it with her whole heart. They lived many more years together in contentment and love, watching their grandchildren grow and the ranch continue to prosper. James died peacefully in his sleep in 1923 at the age of 71, Clara beside him as she had been for 40 years. She held his hand as he took his last breath and whispered that she loved him, knowing he heard even as he slipped away. The grief was enormous, but so was the gratitude for the life they had shared. Clara lived another 7 years, supported and cherished by her children and grandchildren, still sharp-minded and strong-willed until the end. She died in 1930 at 72 in the house she and James had built together, surrounded by family. Her last words were about James, about how she would see him again soon, about how much she had loved their life together. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones. The ranch itself continued for generations after, passing down through their descendants, always called the Cordell Ranch in honor of the cowboy and the widow who had built something lasting from nothing but determination and love. And on summer evenings when the light hit just right, people swore they could sometimes see 2 figures walking hand in hand through the grassland, together still in whatever comes after, the way they had been together through everything that mattered in this life.